Hello and welcome to episode 8 of this tutorial. In this episode, we want to see another type of communication between components, and that type is route parameter communication. So we have been talking about different ways to make the components of our application communicate with one another. So we've seen, very basic methods like, for example, input parameters. We've seen output parameters, output properties, input properties, output properties for, notifying the parent component of something. We've seen more advanced techniques like, for example, shared services with observables, with subjects, observable, with behavior subjects. We've seen other, methods like, for example, the topic of the previous episode where we kind of dynamically rendered instances of a child component, and then we fetched data from those, dynamic instances. In this episode, we will have a, let's say simpler topic. I know that the topic of the previous episode was a little bit, probably difficult for some people. This episode is going to be a little bit easier, if you will. Let's get started and talk about route parameter communication. So the goal of this episode is to learn how to pass and read route parameters using Angular ActivatedRoute and router. This enables component communication through URLs. Sometimes it's called URLs, a must for deep linking and navigation between detailed pages. So we know that using Angular, we are decomposing our application into smaller components. Sometimes those components need to kind of send data to one another through route parameters. So basically, this is sometimes called client-side routing as well. Without the application or the page being posted back to the server, the routing is going to happen on the client side. And that is what makes application SPAs or SPA, single page applications. So the user will get the impression of some routing happening, but basically what is happening is client-side routing. We're not posting the page to the server. We're doing the routing on the client side, and that is implemented using routing. And routing means that components are kind of communicating with one another. The user is jumping back and forth between different components. So routing happens between components. When you have more than one component, routing becomes meaningful, right? So we want to see how we can kind of create let's say master detail relationship. So a flight and the details of that flight using route parameters. We already have that, by the way. So if, for example, right now in my application, let me close out this guy, by the way. These are from the previous episode. So right now, when I click on the details of a flight, I can see the details of that flight here, right? That is good, but what I want to do now in this episode and what I want to show you is to get the user to, let's say, another page to do some routing, and on that page, the user will see the details of that flight that they have clicked on. So they're gonna again be redirected to another component without the application or the page being posted back to the server. The routing is gonna happen on the client side. Let's implement that. Let's talk about deep linking before we get started with the components. So deep linking, I talked about deep linking here. I said that deep linking is achieved in Angular applications using routing. So what is deep linking in Angular? Deep linking refers to the practice of navigating directly to a specific view or piece of content within a web application using a URL or URL. So often with route parameters. So this allows you to, for example, give the user the possibility of bookmarking a page of your application, because contents of your application or pages will have like unique specific URLs. And if the user bookmarks a URL, using that URL, they will be able to get to that specific view or component or portion of your application, or they can share that link with someone. So even though everything again is happening on the client-side routing, you are allowing the user to bookmark a URL, and using that URL, they will get to that specific page. The scenario that we want to implement, we want to show a list of flights using the flight list component. Again, this is something that is already happening. Then we want to allow the user to click on a flight and get to the flight detail component and passing the flight's ID through the route to that flight detail component. So we're going to use ActivatedRoute in the flight detail component to read and load the correct flight data. What we've got right now is that we've got this flight detail component. So flight detail component is already there, right? It has this input parameter or input property, and inside of the template of this flight detail, we are showing the details of that flight, right? The name of that input property is selected flight, and and this component, this flight detail component, is a child component in our flight list. So if I go to flight list, you can see that here we've got this flight detail component as our child component inside of this parent component, and we are passing a selected flight to this input property. We don't want that. We don't want this flight detail to be a child component of this parent component anymore. We want to get rid of this as a child component for this parent component, and we want to allow the user to click on a flight from this list and be taken to another page specifically for seeing the details of that flight. So let's get started. First, we need to configure some routes. Because we're using standalone components, the routes are defined in app routes TS. So these are the routes that I am going to define, and I am going to talk about these. But basically, if you take a look, I'm saying that when the user navigates to flights, so the URL of your application /flight, go ahead and load this component. Where is this component going to get loaded? I'm gonna get to that. I'm gonna tell you where this component is gonna be loaded. Right now, this route is telling Angular that when the path is /flights, load this component. When it is /flights and then some ID, some number, go ahead and render this flight detail component. And inside of that flight detail component, what we need to do is to render the details of the flight whose ID we have in the route. But before we define the routes, let's talk about these. So each object inside of the routes array is like a rule for the Angular router. So it has these properties: path, component, redirect to, and path match. So we've got multiple routes. Let's examine them. This is the first route that we've got. So the path is empty. So the empty path refers to the root URL of your application. And then whenever the user gets to the root of the application, we're going to redirect the user to this route. So this is the redirect. So when the user goes to the root of the application, they will be redirected automatically to this new route. Then we've got path match full. So path match full, this ensures that redirect only happens if the entire path is empty, not just a prefix match. Let's not talk about these in more detail here because we have a lot to cover. But this is again one option that you can use to control the redirection behavior of the router. Then we've got another path, another route. So the path is flights. So this matches this, for example, route, the root of your application /flights. And the component that's going to get loaded is this flight list component. This means when this route is matched, when this route is entered by the user, the Angular router will load and display flight list component. Where is it going to load that component? In our router outlet, and I'm going to show you the router outlet that we've got in our app component. And then the next route that we've got is this. So the path is flights and then some ID. So it matches any URL like flights and then some value as our ID. So basically this is a string, this is a number, this is a route parameter. This is called a route parameter. This will contain the ID of the flight whose detail we want to show. It captures a dynamic value from the URL like flight ID. And then the component we're going to load is flight detail component. So this component will be shown when the route matches, and it can access the route parameter using ActivatedRoute. So before we continue with the flight list component, I want to go ahead and define these routes inside of our app routes. So let me go to the application. We do not have any routes, as you can see here, but I'm going to define my routes here. So I'm going to remove this line of code and define my routes. So I'm going to run the code to enter my routes that we just discussed. So I'm going to remove this now. And of course, we need to import the components. That's it. Now let's continue. So what is a route object? We talked about these and the different routes. Now let's talk about flight list. Flight list, as I showed you, has a child component, flight detail, but we want to update that. In the flight list, we want to use router link, where we are looping over the different flights that we've got. We are going to render an anchor tag, and inside of that anchor tag we are going to add this router link, and then inside of the router link we can define the route. So the route for that flight, for that specific flight, is going to be /flight, and then the next part is going to be the ID of that flight, which is the route parameter that we just discussed. So this route will match this route that we just discussed, and this route is going to get us to the flight detail component as we discussed. So what is router link? Router link is a directive provided by Angular router module. It allows you to navigate to a different route in your app by binding to a URL or a route path. It's the Angular equivalent of defining an href attribute on your anchor element. But it works with Angular router, meaning that no full page reload, as I said, SPA, single page applications, and preserves component state, animations, guards, and so on. What it does is this. So when the user clicks on that, kind of anchor tag, the user will be taken to this route plus the ID. The ID is going to be the ID of the flight, where ID is replaced with the actual flight ID. So flight ID, if for example it is FL001, the link that will get generated is this. And then the syntax is also important. So this array syntax is shown as route link parameters. So this is going to be the static part, and the flight ID is going to be the dynamic part, which will get generated based on the ID of the current flight in our loop. So let's get to the flight list component. So flight list HTML, and what I want to do now is to get rid of this UL element altogether, and instead enter this router link. And of course we need to import router module in our flight list component. Flight list TS, we need router module in our imports. So I'm going to import router module. So let's I don't know whether you saw that or not, but these are converted to an anchor tag. And if I hover my mouse here, you can see the URL that this link is going to take me to. right? So this is the ID dynamically generated, and this is the static part. Now let's go ahead and let's update the flight detail component. The flight detail component is not going to be a child component for flight list anymore. So basically, it's going to have this property called flight. In the constructor, we are going to have the activated route. We are going to have our flight service. The flight service is going to, for example, get us some flights. And then inside of the ng on init, we are going to get the value of the ID as our route parameter coming in the route. So take a look at the syntax. This is the dependency we defined in our constructor: snapshot, parameter, map, and then get, and then the name of the route parameter. We're going to capture that, store it inside of flight ID. And if flight ID has a value, we're going to get to the flight service, use get flights, subscribe, and we are going to find the flight whose ID matches the flight ID we've got in the route. So let's go ahead and implement this in the flight detail. So flight detail component. As you can see right now, flight detail only has one input parameter, one input property, which is currently set by its parent, which is the flight list. I'm going to get rid of this, and then I am going to write the code. I am going to write the code. So the constructor, activated route, flight service, and then getting the value of our route parameter. So let me go ahead and remove this and import activated route from Angular router and flight service. So flight service, again, has some flights, right? So we're going to take the ID from the route and use the flight service to get the details of that flight. And then we're going to show these details in the template. So the purpose of ng on init here, let's talk about the ng on init. So inside of the ng on init, again, we are getting the value of this route parameter, the ID. So when the flight detail component loads, we want to read the flight ID from the URL. We are going to use the ID to find that flight from our service based on the ID. So this piece of code that we have in ng on init, this .route is the dependency that we have defined in our constructor. The dependency is of type ActivatedRoute. ActivatedRoute allows us to access the route parameter. Then we've got snapshot. It takes a snapshot of the current route state. And then parameter get is going to retrieve the value of this route parameter. Example, if the URL is flights FL001, the value inside of this ID is going to be FL001. What is activated route? On which we have defined a dependency. So this gives you access to route data, including the ID, for example, as a route parameter, query strings or query string parameters, like, for example, sort ascending, route configuration, static and resolve data, and so on. So here we're only using activated route to read the value of this route parameter defined in the routing. So here we're using to read the ID, and we have defined this route in our app routes TS. And then we've got this piece of code. So this piece of code is gonna use the get flights method from our flight service, and then it's gonna subscribe to it, and it is going to check the fact of whether there is a flight in that flights array which matches the ID that we have in our route. So checks if ID was found in the URL. This is the code. Then calls the flight service get flights. This returns an observable, right? And it subscribes to that observable. and runs the callback when the data is received, the callback is going to use find to see if there is a matching flight. And if there is a matching flight, it's going to store that flight inside of the local property that it has. So again, remember, this is the array that we've got, and this is the get flights, which is going to return an observable. I think we defined this in episode 2, I guess. So example scenario, if for example the route is this, the route config will capture this route, is going to, the component is going to capture this using ActivatedRoute. It fetches the flight list from the service, is going to check whether it sees, a matching flight, and so on. Now, in the flight detail component, we want to show the details of a flight. Flight was a local property on our flight detail component TypeScript file. If there is a value in there, let's go ahead and show the details. Otherwise, let's render ng template. This is the template we are going to render. So flight list, flight detail. Flight detail HTML file already contains this piece of code. I am going to get rid of this, and I am going to write the new version of my code. I think the refactoring was mostly done on the flight detail. So previously, flight detail only had one input property. Right now, it is capturing the route parameter and then communicating with flight service to kind of get the details of that flight. So add a router outlet. This is already there, but let's talk about it. So inside of app component HTML, we will have our router outlet. So what is router outlet? Router outlet is the place where the components that match a route will get loaded. So router outlet is a placeholder directive that tells Angular where to render the matched component when a route is activated. It's part of Angular's router module. So we've got, router outlet already there. We are going to double check that in app component. So app notification will stay there. It will always be visible, right? Because you know about this, right? I think implemented this in episode number, I guess, 6. And then router outlet, which is, of course, going to be, the placeholder for the components. So let's do something. Let me go ahead to app component, and I want to remove the flight list for now, as well as the app passenger manager. And by default, select flight, since it's not a property of app flight detail. So let me pause the video and see what the problem is. I know the problem is from the flight list component, the HTML. We need to get rid of this now. Don't need that. So you remember in the routes that we defined, when the user gets to the root of the application, we're going to redirect the user to the flights route. And this is the route, the flights, right? The flights. And then the flights is going to do what? It's going to, load the flight list component in our router outlet. So in our app component, this is the place where the flight list will get, rendered. So this is the, flight list component now. Now, if I click on this one, on this link, what is going to happen? Let's go to the flight list HTML. It's going to take me to this route and the flight ID. And we know from the routes that we defined, whenever we've got flights plus a route parameter, this is the component that we want to be loaded, flight detail component. Where is it going to get loaded again? Again, in app component here. It's going to get loaded here. So again, client side, routing. And then, of course, when the flight detail component is going to get rendered, is going to take the route parameter using ActivatedRoute, is going to communicate with our service to get the details of that flight. It's going to capture it inside of this flight object. And then what it's going to do is it's going to, render the details of that flight. So let me click this, and as you can see, we've got, a route, a new route, so flight and then flight ID, and these are the details. Now, what happens if I, put like a non-existing flight ID? It says flight not found, and this is the NG template, right? So let me get back to the flights. If I click on this one, I will get the details of this flight now. Another type of communication between two components, master detail relationship, if you will, flight list and flight details. This time using routing and route parameters. So I have already talked about these, and then think of router outlets, render whatever component matches the current route right here. I told you that this is like a placeholder, and then we tested this as well, and the summary. So router link is the directive that allows you to kind of like create a route using the static part, the dynamic part, inside of an anchor, for example. Activated route is your dependency. Is like your dependency in your component that is going to allow you to kind of fetch the route parameter. paramMap.get allows you to get to a specific route parameter and read its value from the route. And router outlet is a placeholder that you're going to put probably in your app component, where the components that match a specific route are going to get, rendered into. And that was it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching this episode. If that's the case, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.